Hello, everyone, and welcome to Flight Club. We are some minutes late, and this is because Google was late today. Sorry for that. But we finally made it. My name is Klaus Leopold, and I'm the co-host of the show. And with me is the second one, who is called Cliff. Cliff, where are you?
Hello and good evening, everyone. Yes, as Klaus said, sorry about the challenges there. Hopefully you all saw the chat messages and you're aware of what was happening. But we are here now, and that's what's important. So let's jump straight into it. I would like to introduce you to my friend Nivia. She is a wonderful human, and I'm very glad to have her as our guest this evening. Nivia, do you want to say hi to everybody quickly?
Hi, everybody, and I'm honored to be here with you all and fellow wonderful humans, Klaus and Cliff.
Awesome. So we have a couple of things planned for you today. We're going to talk about some interesting topics and also take some questions. So a couple of things just to give you some logistical stuff before we get started. First thing is ask your questions in the chat. We will take as many questions as we can. We do have some things pre-planned and prepared, but also it's more interesting if we talk about the topics that are interesting to you and things that come up. So feel free to ask anything as we go. The other thing to say is if you enjoy the video and if you like this kind of stuff that we're doing, it would be super cool if you hit the like and subscribe button. Yes, pointing at it, nice. That button over there. So hit the like and subscribe button. Super cool to see if you're enjoying the video content. YouTube is telling me every week that only about 27% of people who watch our videos are currently subscribed, which is surprising, but kind of cool because it means there's a lot of potential. We have almost, I think, just over 2,000 subscribers, or yeah, just over 2,000 subscribers now, and obviously looking to be able to reach out to more of you and tell our interesting stories like the one we're going to hear about today. Cool. So let's kind of jump in just to sort of frame a little bit of what we're going to discuss today. The topic is fairly open and fairly ambiguous: leadership, innovation, and superpowers. I picked this title partly because I thought Nivia would like it, and also just because I think it's an interesting kind of way to sort of frame us. To give you a little bit of background, Nivia and I worked together during our time at Spotify. She helped coach me through, well, I guess coach me off the ledge a few times, perhaps, is how I would describe it, but certainly helped me with some challenging situations, gave me lots of interesting guidance. She's an experienced coach, experienced engineering leader, and is also now director of engineering at Spotify, leading a group of folks in the ads team. So I think it was probably one of the most exciting promotions that I saw at Spotify in my time. I remember being super pumped when I saw Nivia taking the step up to be director. And I have no doubt you're doing an amazing job, and that's why we're here today. So yes. So let's hear from Nivia. I'm curious. So a lot of the time, just to kind of sort of ease us in, people kind of think of being a leader or a manager in an organization. They're most of their experience of managers and leaders, as Esther Derby likes to joke, is basically the people are just telling, selling, and yelling. And that's kind of their response or what they've seen as managerial and leadership kind of stuff. That's what people do. I'm curious, from somebody who is doing this and doing this at a senior level, what is it like being a leader in an agile organization? What does it actually involve?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And I also should say, Cliff as well, he's a peer coach. So he's also coached me off cliffs and coached me on challenging situations as well. So I would love to hear both from your experience, because I consider you a leader, Cliff, and yourself as well, Klaus. But yeah, if we're telling, yelling, and selling, to me, those are failure modes of leadership, and they should really be sort of like the last resort. What it's really like, this varies a little bit as you move into, senior leadership and less like direct line leadership, as some might call it. But what I would say is the leadership in an organization that promotes agility, and I'm not talking about big capital A agile. I'm talking about promotes like learning, promotes curiosity, promotes shipping regularly. It needs to look a lot more like supporting, facilitating, unblocking, and growing. Like those are the verbs that should be active in your day. If you're telling, yelling, and selling to your directs, that's probably a sign that there's something not working there. I do often tell yell and definitely yell upward because I practice like managing up very intentionally. So I have no problems yelling at my superiors. But when it comes to my folks, that's not the way we want to do things. And I bet that's probably true, right? Like I'm sure that's your experiences as well.
Sure. I think often what I've seen people kind of assuming is that, in a world where we're sort of agile and trying to create these healthy, inclusive environments, it's almost like people get scared and feel like that they can't do anything. And I think often what I've seen is people sort of taking a stance of like, I jokingly refer to it as kind of abdicating responsibility rather than, out of fear of overstepping the boundaries. And often what I've seen in agile organizations is actually a lack of leadership and a lack of people taking responsibility, rather than a situation where, there is actually kind of, I don't know, I think hierarchy often gets a very bad name because people have only seen really bad versions of it. But having actually like some different perspective, and we talk about this a lot in the Flight Devils world, there's a different view that somebody gets from 10,000 feet and from 100,000 feet. And that is valuable for different things. So I think it's helpful that we're learning to blend all of these perspectives together.
Yeah. I also love what you mentioned, which is like the fear of being an intentional leader in an agile organization. I wonder if you agree, Cliff and Claus, but I think it comes from this notion of like teams need to be self-motivated and self-directed. And so any leadership is seen as detrimental. And I haven't found that to be actually true. I'd love to hear from your perspectives, because oftentimes what I notice is that it's the actual task commands that need to be self-directed and that need to go away. But leadership to provide clarity, leadership to unblock, leadership to drive forth a strategy is still very much necessary. But you don't need to be telling people how to do their actual job because we've hired smart people. So to me, that's where like we start to go wrong with this whole notion of like agile leadership and how it might differ, and then people start to abdicate responsibility. And I'm curious if you agree with that hypothesis, I guess.
I'm curious, Klaus, if you were going to look like you might be about to say something on that.
Yeah, well, no, I totally agree. And yes, we hire smart people because they can do the job, right? I'm just curious what you think about this, because this also needs quite a lot of alignment. So if I'm the leader, I have everything under control. I take all the decisions, so I know what's right, right? But if others are suddenly taking decisions and just doing their job, I mean, that's the reason why we hired them. This can only be done when there's really alignment. So we are heading in the same direction. So what can we do to establish this kind of alignment?
Oh my goodness. So Cliff, you know my pet peeve about the org we won't name specifically, wink wink, about the whole like autonomy. Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
I find it both interesting and sometimes frustrating where when we hear that term, we don't realize that autonomy doesn't necessarily preclude alignment. In other words, if everybody's autonomous, all you have is chaos. Like everybody, can you imagine, at the moment I'm y'all know where I am. But my place of employment has 7,000 people. We can't be autonomous. That's a ridiculous notion. But where we have to be is aligned autonomy. And to me, what that means is exactly what you're saying, Klaus, which is like, we need to agree on our direction. We need to agree on broad ways of getting there. And again, this is where the leadership needs to occur. Once we agree on those things, the specific execution and implementation details should have room for autonomy, and the culture should have room for autonomy. That's what we don't want. I think somebody just wrote agency versus autonomy, and that anchors super, super well for me, because the autonomy can't necessarily be on the strategy or the work. It has to be on the on ensuring that we are moving directionally but intentionally together, and in the small ways of getting there, that needs to be autonomous. And definitely how we express ourselves in the culture absolutely has to be autonomous.
Yeah, I totally agree with this. I think I was quite surprised in the first couple of weeks when I arrived at the company, as you say, that we shall not name. But there was this sort of insane amounts of autonomy, but really I was kind of confused as to like what direction is the org actually trying to go in. And for sure there was a lot of cool stuff that was being done, but just like the amount of like everybody's charging off in their own direction. And I think part of the challenge is that somewhere inside like the world of agile, somebody came up with this idea that sort of the product owner or the team themselves would be like mini CEOs or whatever. And I have no idea whose idea this was, but it's like, I don't know. If you ever try to work for a company with more than one CEO, I don't know, like this tends to be quite chaotic. Like, I mean, I can imagine that in some rare cases it works, but 400 CEOs in one company, I'm not sure. Like that sounds like the recipe for a mess. Yeah,
I would love to know where that has actually, like, is there anywhere in our collective, we're talking about a lot of experience on this call between the three of us. Like, I won't reveal your ages, but mine alone adds about 20 years of mostly learning and some leading experience. And so I want to know, like, have we actually seen that work in the way it was intended? This notion that, first of all, the product owner can be sort of like the crowned royal, and then that they can really be so many crowned royals in an organization. Like, to me, that I've never seen that really operate in nothing but like very small startups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I think I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and we were discussing this idea of specifically in the Spotify context of having this thing of like shared leadership responsibility. And my view on this was basically that I said, if you have a situation, I think I actually was inspired by Jason Yip because I think he wrote something about this. A bunch of interesting stuff. If you're on the stream, don't know Jason Yip, definitely read his things. He's got a fantastic series of blog posts, very short, concise, smart ideas distilled down. What he said, if I remember correctly, or well, what I remember discussing in the context of this conversation, which may have come from Jason, was this idea that basically if you have shared leadership that really, really works, it will outperform a single strong leader, right? But however, if you have really shitty leadership and three people who are kind of intense and in conflict with each other, that would obviously perform worse than one single, like not a dictator, but one single strong leader.
Oh my gosh.
You find a way to actually bring together those different perspectives rather than just making it about fast decision making. Then you get better decisions. And in there is kind of the nuance for me that I think often people miss is that, I mean, in no scenario, like where do you get to exist in any part of the world where you are free of any constraints? Like it's your family, it's your business partners, it's the country you live in, it's the laws of the land, like taxes. All of these things are external constraints. So pretending that you're somehow autonomous and free to do whatever the hell you want, I don't know, like it never existed. Like, what are you on about?
Not even in my own house. My cat is the absolute ruler of my household. And so that's not true even at home for me.
I think maybe cats are the closest we get to real, like completely autonomous, like because they just don't care. Like, you want to sit there, you want to eat that? Nah, that's maybe that's the case. So the question for me, sorry, go for it, Klaus.
No, just maybe it's a little bit of a pendulum. So it was probably totally in this command and control and Tayloristic view of the world, and then someone tried to do something totally different, so it somehow swings in the other direction. But I think either this or that is not the right place to be.
Yeah,
excellent point. Polars are never, like, extremes are on either side never truly work. By the way, I think somebody said Jason Yip, YIP. He's a former colleague of Cliff's, a current colleague of mine, and one of the wisest people I happen to know, on top of the people in this present company, of course.
Yeah, I typed in the chat as well, just so people can see how it's spelled. If you just Google him, you'll find his blog posts and articles. Interesting. Rita Goodbody mentioning just as less hierarchy, more alignment. Can layers of management be the problem? What do you think about this?
Yeah, it's interesting because where I currently work is relatively flat when you compare it to some of the other tech organizations. Definitely layers of management, but it's all in the nuance because a flat organization has its own problems. So, for example, uh, I'll have to abstract this so that I don't reveal too much. But like right now, there's a group that has a fairly flat organization. But what that also means is that, first of all, it's hard to grow because if the organization is so flat, then you really have nowhere else to grow into, and that could be problematic for retention and motivation. But aside from that, a very flat organization requires a lot more context switching, and context switching we know is expensive. So that's not something we want to do either. So the question should always be like, what is the right amount? When we say this or that, we're always talking about what's the nuance, what's in between. And I think you can test this really, which is how quickly information disseminates. If information takes a really long time to disseminate, already that's a sign that there's probably too many layers. Or if information gets like really lost in translation, that's a sign. So that should be the starting point to working towards, okay, we remove one layer, what happens? We remove two layers. And it'll start to feel like, okay, we're getting to a place where information is disseminating, but also what's also happening, or maybe a guardrail of what's not happening, is people are not losing growth opportunities, people are not losing motivation, so on and so forth. Like, that's where I feel like a good method of finding like what the right levels are.
Yeah. I like what you say about it being a bit of a trade-off. It's very rare that something is to one extreme or the other is kind of the point. It's somehow like maybe in a certain context, a balance of being a little bit more one way to slightly more the other way. But there's usually quite a lot between the two poles in my experience. Like the far left and the far right extremes are usually actually a lot further apart than people think. Yeah, I like that. A really sort of nuanced consideration of how to think about this. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I'm curious about in this is that, like, you've gone recently through this transition from being sort of a normal manager or whatever that means to a different type of a role, right?
To a non-normal manager.
Yeah. I don't know that Nivia's ever been a normal manager in that sense. Yeah, I mean that in a good way, of course, but you know what I mean? Like, it's this sort of from a traditional kind of managing some people directly. And one of the things that changes as you start to level up in the organization is, at least from my experience, you're sort of managing a little bit, I guess by proxy is the one word that I've used to describe this. It's not, you don't directly talk to the people, you talk to people who talk to people who talk to people who talk to people, that kind of a thing.
Exactly.
So what is different in your experience from being a manager directly versus being a manager sort of one or two levels removed? How does this play out?
Yeah, that's excellent question and point. And in an interesting way, I feel like it's also related to the whole conversation we just had about flat organizations, right? Because what you said, like, you are, as a leader of leaders, you're indirectly, thank you for that term, Suraya. As a leader, you're definitely leading by abstraction. You got to make sure that your message translates, and you are also dealing with a lot less on the ground information. So I'll say, from my seat, one of the most significant changes that happened to me, and I struggled for a while with this, which is getting comfortable with not having the direct, not being the source of truth for something. So, for example, if you are a direct leader, and especially if you're an engineering leader, you may know the code base. So you might literally be the source of truth, or you work so close with the team that you can answer questions, or you feel really confident about your proximity to the actual knowledge and where the rubber meets the road, or where things are really working. As you move towards that, this is no longer true. And so you can go into a crisis mode where you start to try to replicate that source of control. And this is where bad leadership comes from, where you don't let go of that control, because you worry, because what you see, you think information and being the source of truth was my only source of power. And so when I don't have it anymore, I lose confidence.
Yeah.
And so what I found is that you have to find ways you have to find other things that will excite you, about this reality, and that will also make you confident in your ability to lead when you don't have the information firsthand.
Yeah.
I'll pause there because that's saying a lot, but I can talk about that for 13 hours uninterrupted.
I think it's interesting because I've seen a lot of folks struggling with that transition, and specifically in an agile organization. I think it's often coupled with the agile organization that when we start to like visualize work and actually see what's going on, you don't necessarily have to be as in the weeds with your teams. And I've seen this a lot in sort of in a flight levels context where we're building these visualizations at a level above the team. Suddenly folks are starting to say, oh, now I know what my job as a manager is. I'm trying to keep those things flowing. And there's some coordination stuff that I can do. And there's some questions that I can lean into sort of about broad architectural questions, kind of, does this solve the customer's problem type questions? And these kind of things, I think, it really helps people to see a little bit. But so often it's just, if you're only in the team, that's all you're going to see. That's all you're going to know. I like this kind of stuff. I think it's so important to help people to see that there is some value in what they do, and that it's not that the old way is necessarily wrong. It's just there are benefits to kind of focus your attention over here, and we will keep kind of the team level stuff running. I think it really makes a difference.
Because it looked like you're about to say something, so I'll cede the floor to you, but I wanted to pick up on a point too that you just made, Cliff. I'm happy to hold that thought if you wanted to go first, Claus, and then I'll jump back in.
No.
Go for it?
Go for
it. So you said something to me that was also important, which is like you have to find new ways to be impactful. And what does that mean, and what does that look like? And I know it still sounds abstract when we talk about it here, because it's not until you live it till you realize how much of a full-time job it is, Cliff. So I like that. I think just to give two quick examples about what that means is like, at my level, and I'm sure this is true, the higher you go, the time scales, just like the numbers are become exponential, right? And so as a direct manager, I may be dealing on a time scale about what I need to ship in the next 2 weeks, in the next month or so. But when we talk about at the director level, if I am thinking about next week or the next 2 weeks, it's either because we have a problem or a bug or a situation, or I've been pulled in. Oftentimes as a leader, I'm always thinking about, in quarters even, if not half years, and maybe even the year time scale. So my planning is a completely different thing, because by the time the teams and the direct managers reach that point, they have to be ready, and I'm the person to get them ready. And the other point that both Barbara and Jaco mentioned about the control of illusion, delusion of control, that's awesome. I love that.
I like those framings.
I think that's it's back to what I meant. Like the higher you go, you move further away from the things you may have started out loving. You have to find new things that excite you, and you have to let go of that control. And the reality is, if you don't do that, you will be deeply unhappy as a leader, and it will become obvious, and it will start hurting your teams.
Yeah.
I mean, it somehow even translates a little bit to the flight level. So when we think of flight level 3, which is like the strategy, so we're talking about years. So where do we see our organization? Like in 3 years, we try to break it down to 1 year, maybe to like month basis. But then we need to somehow talk about the month. Like you said, okay, the quarters. So let's think in quarters. That's more like the flight level 2 kind of thing. And then we break it down to the flight level 1, which is the teams, where we think in weeks, like next sprint, this sprint, and so on. Makes totally sense, actually.
Yes. Know your flight levels, people.
I think that's exactly what I was thinking about, is just how often people kind of miss that. Actually, what we're often missing in organizations, I've seen this a lot, is that you go from this very high level strategy to, I have to try to understand what to do in the detail. And there is that somehow breaking it down into smaller manageable chunks, like the different time scales of quarters or something like this. Like, okay, like we need something a little bit more manageable, and also just a checkpoint where we can say, okay, well, so we did some stuff. Are we on track? Does it make sense? Like, people use that feature, or that thing is actually live, but like, are we being more successful as an organization? Does it fit into some sort of coherent strategic direction? Does it move us forward? I'm really curious. I see Barbara Frontera mentioning Jay Bloom's work on misalignment of timescales. I know Jay Bloom, but I do not know this particular work, and so that will be my reading over a glass of wine a little bit later on. I'll go have a look. Yeah, sounds super cool.
Yeah, it does. And Jade Bloom is a hard follow, similar to Jason Yip, similar to Claus and Cliff. Like there are certain people that I think, another person I would definitely mention are Ruth Milan. Like there are certain people who have lived these experiences in ways that, you don't always have to learn the hard lessons on your own. And so when we can incorporate these things, but remember, they are their experiences. They may or may not apply, but like what we can learn from them can at least help us build good models. So good call out on Jade.
Yeah, so +1 from me on both Jade and Ruth. Ruth Milan, Jade Bloom, both fantastic.
Yeah.
Cool question, actually, in the chat. Yeah.
Yes.
Over a class.
Yeah, Rita is asking a question. I really like it. So, what are the 3 superpowers that are absolutely needed for being a good leader?
It's like a perfect question. I like it.
Who wants to start? I know for one that I use very regularly. I guess I'll start.
Go for it.
Yeah, clarity. If you are not bringing clarity, what the hell are you doing in your job? I mean, really. So what that means to me, just to put a finer point on it, is as Cliff mentioned earlier, there's a lot of like bottoms up and top down conversations happening, and oftentimes they're not connecting. We have to be the clarity bringers. You don't know how many times that most of my job is just literally asking simple but obvious questions like, is that really what you meant? Or I heard this and I heard that and they don't match. Why is that? Like, I get kudos on this in my development talks quite often about how I'm a clarity bringer. And I joke that really I'm just the master of the obvious. And by stating the obvious, it forces the conversation and it brings clarity. And sometimes I will literally stop meetings if I don't feel that we've arrived at a level of clarity that allows us to move forward meaningfully. So that is definitely one of my superpowers.
Yeah,
who else?
That's a good
Tell
one.
me more superpowers.
I think one, so actually, funnily enough, keeping in theme, because it builds clarity, as one of the ones that Esther Derby talks about quite a lot, and the 2 others she mentions being conditions and constraints. And the conditions, I think, is a fairly obvious one to most people. Is there's sort of the environmental effects. Do people have the right kind of cultural space and so on? But the one that I think is often overlooked is the constraints piece. And so I think this is really important, making sure that people understand, as Esther terms it, what should we always do or never do as like the hard constraints. So don't break the law, don't punch your coworkers in the face, this kind of stuff, right? Sometimes it needs to be said so people just get it. But also, you can book a flight or take a day off without asking my permission is quite a powerful thing for people to understand. Which are the constraints that they can move within, which ones are flexible and which ones are hard. And I think very often what we do I try to get people to do this again when we're working with flight levels, is talk about what are kind of those boundaries for things like changing scope or changing direction of a project or a piece of work. You want people to have some kind of an idea of what they can do, but what's the limit? Like, and it's quite interesting because in the context of the Flight Levels Academy, we've had multiple conversations like roles and responsibilities, this kind of thing. Who does that? And when should I tell you? When should I ask permission? When should I involve you in the decision versus just tell you what I did? And all of these kind of things, I think, is really powerful. And people sort of assume that, as a manager or as individuals, you kind of just know this. But I think it's one of the ways that you can bring actually some clarity to the situation as well. So I would emphasize that as a second superpower if I can.
Yeah. I don't know if I can add the 3rd superpower. I mean, I would somehow probably rephrase the clarity a little bit, because what I'm thinking of when I think of clarity, I personally need a lot of clarity, because otherwise I'm basically screwed. So I try not to be the smartest guy in the room, which is quite easy for me actually. But this also helps actually a lot. I think other people, because you're always raising these questions, like you said, the master of the obvious, right? I really like this term, by the way. So, but it's really like, yeah, having the right question actually by the hand, and then yeah, I think. But this is clarity in the end. I
Oh,
think so.
I like how you framed it though, and I think Barbara's also submitted humility as another like aspect, or almost like a sibling of it, because it takes
Mm,
you have to be confident in order to be humble, and I don't know that people realize that. And the more confident you are, the more you. So the people who never say sorry, by the way, are the oh my gosh, they're usually the most insecure people. The people who can't admit their faults
yeah,
always, always people who struggle with insecurity.
yeah,
And I think that's what you're also talking about, like not only like the clarity, but also being that type of person to like take ownership of being humble enough to say, I don't know, and inviting conversation.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
I
Yeah.
think so. So it's interesting because while I was listening to Klaus talking, I was thinking that there was actually another one which he was using at the same time. There was obviously an element of humility in it, but also just the humor and the calmness with which
Yeah.
Klaus often will explain things, talking about a complicated, difficult subject in a way that just kind of relaxes people. And I think as a leader to somehow, like if I could use the term of sort of having your shit together somehow, but also just being calm in that situation. Like there's so few things that really will just make people want to follow someone than seeing somebody get up on stage, explain a complicated topic with some sense of humor, some sense of humility, a little bit of self-deprecation, and just like people are like, oh, that doesn't sound so scary at all. And I think that's quite a powerful thing to be able to do. So yeah, I
Love
often need
that.
a reminder to just chill out, and like it doesn't all have to be some. I'm trying to remember, one of my peer coaches at Spotify once said to me something. Do you remember what smiling looks like? And I was like, yeah. He says you should do that more often. It was a
Nice.
wonderfully
Oh my
blunt
god.
thing. We had a very good relationship, and I was like, I think about it quite often. It was just like, yeah, like just chill out. Yeah,
Yeah,
just
Nice.
we can all use some of that clause.
doing it in a good way. Yeah,
Yeah. I was
yeah.
just gonna
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
no, I was just gonna quickly say I do well with the humor, and I could definitely use more of the clause magic of calmness, because I'm a high energy person, and sometimes you just need to breathe. So please, clause, teach us your ways.
Yeah, I don't know. Sure.
Maybe it's the
Um,
Raki that.
yeah, by the way, I'm in Greece and this is Raki, so
Yes,
that's
you
very
have to drink
important
it at
stuff.
every meal. Anybody, anywhere you go, somebody will offer you Rocky. It doesn't matter that it's 10 o'clock
Exactly.
in the morning. I spent time in Crete too. You will be drunk by lunchtime. So enjoy.
I just told Cliff the story that I went to a butcher on Saturday with Catherine, my wife, and they offered us Iraqi at 10 in the morning. I was like, you sure?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Not.
Um, but getting back to, I picked up some terms that both of you mentioned, and this is probably something within Spotify. My peer coach. Um, is there a concept of a peer coach or something like this in Spotify? Just yeah. What is
Yeah,
it? Sounds
I
cool.
I don't know that it's official, but the people that what I found is that uh, I don't know how predominant it was, Cliff, and maybe you do, but I found that all of us, first in the coaching community, but also as leadership, naturally gravitated to others who we identified as people who have either a skill set or a behavior that we admire, and we would just approach them about like how do we learn, just like I made the compliment to you about your calmness. And so then that sort of triggers the notion of maybe we can coach each other on these things. And the nice thing about that is um, uh, oftentimes we only think of like mentorships and sponsorships, which immediately puts it in a framing of there has to be like a powerful person versus a learning person, but that's not always true. depending on the topic, it changes. So I think for Cliff, the things he was my peer coach about was things about at scale. Like when we're dealing with really large numbers, when we're dealing with really large systems, what are some ways we can really approach it and not lose the humanity, I think is a lot of what I learned from my peer coaching to Cliff. I have no idea what he learned to me, and that's fine. But I was grateful, and I had like peer coaches on like a number of things based on what their particular superpowers were.
Cool.
So I can actually give two examples. So the thing that I would often talk to Nivia about was this: how do you like helping me to see the other perspective that I just didn't see? And very often what would happen is I would get kind of stuck that someone was doing something, or I wouldn't understand why they were doing it, and she would just be like, have you considered this, or what about that? And it wasn't necessarily that she was telling me what the other person saw, but helping me to realize that the other person could have a vastly different view from me, and still be a smart and person worth respecting. Because I think I sometimes lose that when I'm just like, but it's just so obvious to me that we would go left, and then it's like, why is it like this? Like, why don't you see this? Like, you know, because it's obviously not a bad idea to go left, but sometimes it's also a good idea to go right, and you're like, you just and so I think it's fascinating how often this happened. And so the other scenario that I was referring to was, it was actually two of us that would pair up, and it was very similar to a friend of the show, Siggy, who's always talking about this thing of a sparring partnership, which I love that metaphor. So someone who you can just kind of, they'll throw some punches, they make sure you're on guard and not letting your hands down too much, and like if you're sort of slacking on the job, you might catch one in the ear or something, but they're not going to hurt you too much. They're just going to make sure that your weak ideas kind of get a little bit of a kicking, and when you're in a sort of a challenging situation, you've got someone to kind of work out and stay fit with. And so I think quite a common concept that certainly some of the coaches I worked with did. Anyway,
I just wanted to like violently agree with that, because here's the thing, and I was just talking to another peer of mine. The reason why it's important to have a sparring partner is because, first of all, some things you really have to get it right. You have few chances, especially at higher levels of visibility. So you don't want your first time you have to sort of be in that situation to be the first time you've actually practiced how it might work out. And you certainly don't want to do that. You certainly want to be careful about where you expose that kind of vulnerability to, because if you do that with a direct report, it may actually send them reeling because they're seeing you in an unfinished state. And sometimes that's okay, but there's certain stakes where that's not true. So it's important to have that sparring partner, because you can be vulnerable without actually being harmful. And that's why I wanted to like beat this point to death. So for everybody out there, even if you're not leadership, that doesn't matter, but find your sparring partner. It needs to be somebody you trust. Ideally, it's somebody who understands your context, but is not impacted by the outcomes of that discussion. So not necessarily your manager, maybe a manager elsewhere, or a peer who's, again, a little bit removed, a couple of steps removed.
I really like that. And there's a very cool question in the chat, but Klaus, were you going to pick up on that question, or?
Yeah, but go for it, Cliff.
Okay.
Yeah,
Barbara,
I think this is directed at me.
I would think so.
Put it on the screen, as people say. Is there a particular superpower you need as a woman in tech and in leadership? Great question.
Oh boy. First of all, my sense, based on what Barbara has texted before, is she probably knows some of these answers, so she might be your next guest. But I'll give you a shot of what mine are. Yes. So, and I tweeted about this too. So, what I notice is it's hard to be humble if everyone else in the room assumes you're not an expert. And so it's a really tricky balance for both women and people who identify as a minority. So in the US, that's typically Black people, Latin American people, people of color, people from different backgrounds, trans people, LGBTQA people. Because what happens is, if you are too humble, but you're also of those underrepresented groups, the side effect could be that you are completely discounted and dismissed as either not being powerful or knowledgeable. So that's a tricky thing to balance. And the way I balance is this. Somebody summarized it by saying, nobody, everybody enjoys you, but nobody doubts you're the boss. And that's the type of tightrope I have to walk as a woman. And I'll give you a really quick example, Barbara, and see how it resonates with you. So although I will ask obvious questions, there are times where either I let everybody sort of give their input, but then I go back and say, well, here's how I think about it. And what that does is immediately says, I wasn't asking because I don't know. I was asking because I want to open up the room for conversation. You don't have to do it a lot, but you have to do it enough so that people don't discount that you're asking because you are not an expert. You still have to establish your credibility as a woman. This is probably less so, I imagine, for men or non-minoritized people in general. But for minoritized people, it's extremely important to do things like that. Never give away your power or your expertise, but you still have to practice humility. And yes, that shit is exhausting.
Yeah. So obviously, as a white male, I play life on the easier settings, so I can't speak too much about sort of the experience of it. But one thing that I can say is that, and I would encourage everyone who does look and sound perhaps a little bit like me, to make sure that you're not expecting all of the other folks to just kind of step up and do your job of making sure that you lift other people up and make space for them. Stand back, leave an opening for other people to talk, invite them specifically into conversations, circle back and say, Nivia, you were going to say something and somebody cut you off. These kind of things you can do that contribute. And yeah, keep working on it. Just don't expect everyone else to have to fight for their own rights. You can make sure that you're supporting them in their fight too.
Exactly. Just a quick on that point. Everyone interrupts women, including other women. So the best way to be an ally, as a matter of fact, I don't even say ally anymore. I say accomplice, because an ally can sometimes sort of lean back. They may or may not have the luxury of leaning back. But if you're an accomplice, then you have just as much skin in the game. You are the getaway driver. And so you will do crimes together. The way to be an accomplice is to do exactly what Cliff is saying. Get in there and help block and tackle and call out when you see injustices, and bring people who don't look like the majority to the seat of the table. Because not only will you be growing the voices that are heard, but you also lend them a little bit of their credibility. And I call it starter credibility. Lending them some starter credibility so that they have their opportunity to build their own credibility. So this is what you got to do to be an accomplice.
Mm-hmm. I like this. Yeah. So there's actually a cool follow-on question a little bit related to this, which was, how does one influence upwards? Suryatapa, if I'm saying your name correctly, the question is, how does one influence upwards? Which I guess could be extended to the question that I have as well, just about generally kind of building influence within an organization. But what are your thoughts? How do you influence upwards? Nivia, I guess you have quite a lot of experience with this topic.
Yes, influencing has been a skill I had to intentionally work on, because I realized that nobody's going to make your cases for you, and influencing is not an explicit skill that is taught. And so the first thing you have to understand is influencing is not a bad word. You have to influence. You have to be able to influence, because that's how you earn a seat at the table sometimes. And you have to practice influence perpetually, because the currency, influence is sort of like the payment, and then the revenue you get back is that your teams, whatever you're using your influence for, gets the benefit of that. So how do you actually do that? One of the first things to do is set the mindset that I may or may not have the skill. How do you know if you have the skill or not? I used there was this assessment. I forget who gives it, and maybe that part is not important, but there's definitely assessments that you can use to determine your level of influence. And they ask questions like, how comfortable are you making bold statements? How comfortable are you with discomfort? Like those types of things. And I'll give you a sense of like your level of influence. When I remember it, I'll pass it on to you all, so you can pass it on to the flight club teams. And when you realize that maybe you don't, the next thing you do is you try to start small, but find something that you feel strongly about that is worth practicing influence on, and then keep growing it. What does that look like? For example, and early in my career, I had to influence how on-call might work. It might sound non-controversial, but for engineering, how on-call works is a very controversial, potentially, topic. And so I decided that would be a good practice for my influence, plus it'll build my credibility in many other ways. Because influence and credibility also are siblings. So what that meant is I did my homework, so I knew what the hell I was talking about. That meant I started to have points of views that I would make, but I would say something like, hey, listen, I think this is the direction we need to go. Is there a reason we wouldn't? Is there a difference? And then when I got a signal that, oh no, there's no reason we shouldn't move that forward, then I got bolder. And I would say, let's do that, let's try that. And then as people then said, okay, there's no harm in trying it, then what that does subtly in their mind is you've exerted influence. It's not a bad thing. You didn't manipulate anybody, but what it does is it builds that muscle for you. It builds the credibility, and then you could tackle the next thing, and the person will trust you more because you've proven it on something on a smaller scale. I hope that helps. I don't know. There's probably a ton of other ways that I'd love to hear about too.
I would plus on that. I think a lot of what you described works both for upwards influence, sideways, all forms of influence, basically. And very similar, the way that I think one thing that I often found myself reminding people of, but also needing reminding of myself, is that just because you are in a position of power or some sort of authority doesn't necessarily mean that everybody else understands or feels the same way about that. And what needs to happen is that you need to remember what it's like to actually be somehow the one without power. And part of what I found useful in this, and I think that's probably more relevant to somebody like me than maybe to somebody like you, Nivia. But the reality is that if you're always sort of approaching it with the thing of like, well, I'm now in charge, so I make the decision, as opposed to how do I, or I should just do what you've seen done in the past, which is I tell people, like we talked about earlier, telling, selling, and yelling, rather invite and say, hey, so I have this idea, what do you think about it? And then people say, well, this and this and the next thing. And if you do that enough and you actually take on board what people say, they start to believe that you actually take what they said seriously. And yeah, of course you're influencing them, but they're also influencing you. And so you're involving everybody in the process, which I think is really super powerful.
Yeah, I like what people are saying. Building alliances sound way better, first of all, than influencing. Influencing sounds like an act, like oh, I gotta shape you. Whereas building alliances sounds good to my brain, at least. And yeah, if you have to yell you're in charge, that's because you've lost, like you're not in charge. To your point, right?
Yeah. So we started a few minutes late, so I hope it's okay if we go 1 minute a little bit over, because I had a wrap-up question that I wanted to ask you, which I want to do. But first, I want to quickly just remind everybody that if you enjoyed this episode, and I certainly have, hit the like button, hit subscribe, also join us on the meetup. And then next time you will get an invite in advance so you know about future episodes. We've got a very exciting lineup coming for the new year. Lots of interesting folks to talk about or talk to. And the last thing I wanted to do before I get to that last question is just to emphasize, where was this here? Barbara was mentioning Kat's Hotels work on epistemic justice in organizations. Double plus one from me. It's not a topic that I'm super expert in, but Kat has done a wonderful job of explaining these concepts, and she's taught me a lot in this space. She was actually even on the show a couple of months ago, and maybe we'll have her back again in the future. We can talk about some of these interesting topics too. So yeah, if you're interested, give it a look. Cool. So final question, if it makes it sound ominous somehow and sort of intimidating or scary. There's kind of two ways to ask the question. So the one version of this is basically, what one tip do you have for people who are starting out on their journey, trying to be better leaders and specifically leveling up to be better senior leaders? And the other is sort of to think of it from the sense of what's something that you know now that you wish you knew at the start? It's kind of the same question with maybe two slightly different framing. I'll leave it to you to to choose. And if I keep talking, I give you a few more seconds to think about because I can see your thinking is on over there. So,
You see the steam coming out.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be succinct. And Claus, if you have a ready idea, go for it instead. I would say for me, I'm remembering a sticky note I had early in my career that says, I'm okay with storms, for I am learning how to sail my ship. And the way I would translate that to your question would be, nothing beats going through the thing to really have an understanding and empathy. So lean into, don't be afraid, like lean into complexity, lean into complication, because you will learn how to sail your ship. And then once you learn how to sail your ship, you're just sailing bigger ships, really. Ships don't, it's like learning to ride a bike, basically. It's just bigger bikes, maybe. And so, that's what I would tell myself, or remind myself when I just started out. It's okay to go through these pains. It will come in handy because I have learned to sail my ship.
And if I could click the button, there we go. Excellent. I have trouble for some reason with the interface occasionally. The only thing that I would just add ever so slightly into this is get a mentor, get a sparring partner. This is true for almost whatever you're doing. But think carefully, if you're changing roles or you're stepping into something new, get other people to help you. You don't need to make all the mistakes yourself. And there's a lot of people out there who have been super helpful to me, and plenty who I think can be super helpful to you. So,
+1.
Thank you, Nivia, for joining us. It's been really wonderful to see your face again, to have a conversation. I hope it's not another 2 years before we see each other.
Oh my goodness.
The last time we saw each other was in Sweden. And so maybe you're over here again, maybe I'm in New York. Let's
knows? Just all meet at Claus's in Crete. All right.
Come visit me. There's enough space for everyone.
Is it Hania, or where are you, Herakli or Hania?
Nearby Rectimno, which is like in between Kanya and Heraklion.
I'm on my way. See you in about 24 hours then.
Flying to Kanya. I will pick you up on the airport.
Okay.
Awesome. And to everybody on the live stream and in the chat, it's been super cool. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for sharing and being so interactive. It's really been a super cool episode. Lovely to see you all again. And stay tuned. We will be back again in a few weeks with some more. Thank you so much, Nivia.
Yep.
It's been really wonderful.
Thanks, Nivia.
Cheers and good night, everyone. Bye.
Goodbye. Cheers.